It was a quiet, rainy night in Texas. The sound of raindrops tapping gently on a windshield, the warm yellow glow of a parking lot light, and a white wedding dress, crumpled, soaked, lying on the cold concrete. Ava Black, 24 years old, was the last guest to leave her best friend's wedding. She smiled, waved goodbye, walked into the dark. That was the last time anyone saw her. No scream, no phone call, no goodbye. Just a silence that stretched across 25 years. One autumn afternoon, her aging father began cleaning out her old room. He moved a dusty box, pulled out her Bible, and opened it without thinking. One page was folded down, a line was scribbled in faded ink, and a name appeared, a name long forgotten. Who saw Ava that night? And why did they stay silent all these years? Ava Black was 24 years old, living quietly in Austin, Texas. She worked as a university librarian, the kind of person who found comfort in silence, in the smell of old books, and in the feel of turning paper under her fingers. People often said she had an old soul. Maybe it was true. She was the only child of Martin Black, a retired history teacher. Her mother, Helen, had passed when Ava was 9. From that moment, father and daughter clung to each other, filling the silence in their small house with whispered prayers and shared dinners. Their lives revolved around routine, faith, and small kindnesses. Ava still kept her mother's rosary under her pillow, the beads worn smooth by time. She was gentle by nature, soft-spoken, deeply observant. While others rushed through their days, Ava noticed the smallest things: a chipped mug at the cafe, the way sunlight hit the church windows, how the choir harmonized during evening service. She wrote these thoughts in the margins of her books, in tiny notebooks she kept tucked in her purse. She rarely spoke about herself, but when she listened, she made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Her friends loved her for it. She remembered birthdays, brought soup when someone was sick, and always stayed behind to help clean up. Ava didn't chase the spotlight, didn't date much, and never posted online. She said once, "I like when things are quiet enough that I can't hear what I'm feeling." That was Ava. Quiet but never empty. Sundays were for church. She sat in the same pew, always near the aisle, always early. She sang in the church choir, her voice soft but steady, blending more than leading. Her father would sit in the back, watching, proud and quiet. That routine rarely changed, until the spring of 1996. That spring, something in Ava shifted. She seemed distracted, jumped when the phone rang, and checked her messages more often than usual. Her father noticed, but she brushed it off. "Just work," she said. But he saw the difference. Her eyes didn't rest as long. Her smiles felt practiced, and she began locking her bedroom door at night. Then came the wedding. It was a warm Saturday evening in late April. Ava's best friend, Nicole, was getting married at the Whisper Pines Hotel, just outside the city. Ava helped plan it all: flowers, music, seating charts. She even rewrote the vows with Nicole, sitting up late, candles burning low, laughing about love and life. That night, Ava wore a soft blue dress and pinned her hair back with her mother's clip. She looked peaceful, almost radiant. No one knew it would be the last time they'd see her. After the wedding, guests said their goodbyes. Some waved from the valet line. Others chatted by the fountain, the music fading behind them. One by one, they left. Only Ava stayed behind for a few minutes more. She hugged the bride, whispered something in her ear, then smiled quietly, as if she knew something she wasn't ready to say. That was the last time Nicole saw her. Security cameras at Whisper Pines caught a final glimpse. Ava walked barefoot across the parking lot, heels in one hand, the soft blue dress trailing just above the pavement. Her car was parked near the edge, close to the trees, just outside the light. She paused, looked down at something, then turned her head, as if someone had called her name. Then nothing. No one saw her leave. No one saw her drive away. By morning, Ava's phone went straight to voicemail. Her apartment was untouched. The bed still made. Her mug from the night before still on the counter. Tea leaves dried at the bottom. The front door was locked. Her keys were never found. Martin called every number she'd saved on the landline. Friends, co-workers, even the florist from the wedding. No one had heard from her. He drove to the hotel, walked through the parking lot, retraced her steps. Her car was gone. But something felt off. The valet didn't remember handing her the keys, and no checkout time was recorded. He went to the police that afternoon. They took a statement, asked a few questions, then said maybe Ava needed time away. Sometimes girls her age leave for a few days, the officer said. Martin stared at him. Not Ava, he replied. She wouldn't disappear without telling me. Later that evening, Nicole called, her voice shaking. She said Ava had seemed distracted the past few weeks, always checking her phone, staring off during choir practice. She said she was being watched. Nicole whispered, I thought it was just stress. Martin felt something tighten in his chest. Days passed. Flyers went up around town. Church friends lit candles. The local paper ran a short article, Young Librarian Missing After Wedding. But no one came forward, except one. A staff member at the hotel, a part-time janitor, told police he had seen Ava near a delivery truck that night. She seemed to be arguing with someone, a man tall, wearing dark clothes. But it was dark, he said, and he didn't get a good look. He thought they knew each other. By the time he looked again, she was gone. No license plate, no clear face, no direction. And so the silence began. Martin sat in Ava's room that night. The closet door was slightly open, her winter coat still inside. A soft perfume lingered in the air, lavender and something older, like cedarwood. He looked around, searching for something, anything. But the room remained quiet, still, like she'd just stepped out for a moment, like she was about to return. But she didn't. And from that night on, he would wake to the sound of wind brushing against the window, and wonder if it was trying to tell him something. Martin searched alone. He printed flyers at the local store, folded them carefully, and taped them to every lamppost in Austin. He handed them to shopkeepers, slipped them into mailboxes, left stacks at libraries and grocery stores. At Whisper Pines, he walked the grounds in silence, retraced Ava's steps from the reception hall to the far edge of the parking lot. The hotel manager let him view the camera footage again, frame by frame, but nothing new emerged. Just Ava barefoot, walking into shadow. The police stopped calling after 3 weeks. They said the case lacked evidence of a crime. We'll keep it open, sir, they told him. But Martin heard the quiet behind their voices. They didn't believe she was coming back. Her friends, once frantic, began to fall silent too. Some said Ava had seemed different lately, distant, anxious, distracted. One friend even suggested she might have left by choice. She talked about feeling watched. The girl whispered, but I thought she meant it metaphorically. Martin refused to believe that. Ava wasn't the kind to run. She loved her life, quiet as it was. She loved her father. She made soup on Sundays, called her aunts every week, watered her plants with names like Eleanor and Grace. She would never vanish without a word. He went to the church, spoke with the priests, checked the prayer box. No letter, no sign, just the familiar scent of old candles and lemon oil, the wooden pew she always sat in, the choir schedule still pinned to the bulletin board with her name on it. Blessed are those who mourn, one of the priests said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, for they shall be comforted. At home, her room remained untouched. Her slippers were still by the bed, neatly placed. A sweater hung from the closet door. Her diary was on the nightstand, but the first page had been torn out, cleanly, carefully. Martin held the book in his hands for a long time, trying to feel something, anything. But the silence was louder than ever. A week later, he returned to the hotel again, asked to speak with the banquet staff. Most had moved on. One young man, a server from that night, said he might have seen Ava speaking with someone near the delivery zone. A man in a dark suit, maybe tall. But he couldn't recall the face, or even say for sure if it was her. Sorry, sir, he said, eyes down. It was late. Every detail felt like fog, soft, shapeless, fading the closer you reached for it. Nothing stuck, nothing held, and without evidence, the police had no ground to keep going. Martin sat at the edge of Ava's bed that night. The light in her room was soft, golden, casting a quiet halo on the quilt she had sewn years ago. He picked up her old Bible, opened it to where the ribbon marked Psalm 139. "If I ascend into heaven, you are there," he read aloud, his voice breaking. "If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." But she wasn't. Days turned into weeks. The flyers peeled from poles. Her friends stopped calling. The city went on. And somewhere in that growing silence, Martin began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, his daughter was never coming home. 25 years had passed. Martin Black was now in his 70s. His knees ached in the mornings, and the stairs to the second floor had become slower with each passing year. One afternoon, as summer faded into a soft October, he stood in Ava's old room, looking at the dust gathered along the windowsill. The wallpaper faded at the edges. For the first time in decades, he made a decision. He would clear the room out, maybe rent it, maybe give it new life. The bookshelf by the far wall hadn't been touched since Ava disappeared. As he removed the books, one by one, something slipped behind the wooden backboard and landed with a soft thud. He reached behind the shelf and pulled out a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked, its spine held together with faded thread. It was Ava's. Martin ran his fingers across the name etched faintly inside the front cover. Ava Helen Black. A wave of scent rose with the pages, dust, lavender, and something older. He opened it slowly. About halfway through, a single page had been folded down neatly. At the edge of that page, in a light, hurried hand, someone had written. "Jail," he saw, but he said nothing. Martin froze. He sat down on the edge of Ava's bed, the Bible open in his lap, the room around him utterly still. Jail. Who? And what had he seen? He turned to the back of the Bible. Tucked into the spine, barely visible, was another faded marking. Whisper Pines, April 27th, 1996. The date of the wedding. The date Ava vanished. Martin reached for an old binder he had kept all these years. Inside were his notes, printed guest lists, and names of hotel staff from that night. His hand trembled as he flipped through. There, Joshua Langford, event manager. He remembered the name. Back then, Langford hadn't been interviewed directly. He'd been unavailable during the early days of the search. Martin turned on his old desktop computer, the whir of the fan sounding louder than usual in the quiet house. He searched for the name. Joshua Langford, former event manager, Whisper Pines Hotel. After a few dead ends, he found a match, now living in New Mexico, just outside Santa Fe. He had relocated in late 1997, a year after Ava disappeared. Martin leaned back in his chair. The ceiling fan turned slowly above him, the shadows on the walls unmoving. Something shifted inside him, not fear, not anger, but something colder. A whisper of memory, a pulse of dread, and beneath it all, the faintest flicker of hope. He picked up the Bible again, read the line once more. Jail, he saw. Maybe the world had forgotten. Maybe time had buried the truth beneath layers of silence and dust. But someone had seen. And if someone had seen, then the truth, however dark, however hidden, was still out there, waiting to be found. Martin made the drive himself. A long, dry road stretched toward El Paso, the sky heavy with gray clouds. He kept the windows half open, letting in the warm wind, letting his thoughts settle into the hum of the tires on cracked asphalt. He had no map, only a name and a memory, and a voice inside him that refused to let go. Joshua Langford was now 50. He lived in a small border town, a quiet place with weathered storefronts and dust settling on window panes. Martin had tracked him through a public record search, then called under the pretense of correcting old documents from the hotel's event registry. Langford hesitated but agreed to meet. They chose a small cafe, just off the main street. It was nearly empty. Only a few old men played cards by the window. The lights buzzed faintly. Joshua arrived late, wearing a denim jacket too big for him, hair grayer than Martin remembered, eyes shadowed and restless. He held his coffee like it might disappear if he loosened his grip. Martin sat across from him, the Bible resting inside his bag, unopened but present, like a second witness. When Martin said the name, Ava Black, Joshua didn't speak. He looked down at his coffee, then up at the ceiling, blinking slowly. After a long silence, he said, I remember her eyes. They were wide, quiet, but alert. That night, I saw her leave with someone. Martin leaned in, his voice low. Who? Joshua took a breath, then another. I couldn't stop it. I wasn't supposed to get involved. His fingers tightened around the cup. But I saw her. She didn't look afraid, not yet. But there was tension, something wrong in the way she held herself. Why didn't you say anything? Martin asked, his voice barely steady. Joshua looked at him then, finally looked. Because I was told not to. I was paid not to. Martin didn't flinch. He waited. The man she left with, his name was Elliot Dane. Joshua said, CEO of Westmark Properties. He was the one who sponsored the wedding. Everyone answered to him, including me. Martin knew the name. He'd seen it before, on invitations, on contracts, even on the floral arrangement bill. Joshua continued. There were rumors about Elliot, whispers in staff meetings, stories that never made it into reports. He'd been accused before, by housekeepers, interns, but nothing ever stuck. Legal teams buried it all. Joshua reached into his satchel and pulled out a thin folder, held together by a cracked rubber band. I kept these, he said. Not out of courage, out of guilt. Martin opened the folder. Inside were photocopies, an internal incident report from the hotel, a resignation letter signed by Joshua dated 2 months after Ava disappeared, and a non-disclosure agreement with Dane's name and signature. I wasn't brave, Joshua said quietly, but I never forgot her. Outside, the sky had turned dark. A few drops of rain hit the window, slow and heavy. Martin stared at the papers in his hands, then at the man across the table. Someone once said, Martin murmured, the only thing worse than doing nothing is doing nothing when you know better. Joshua didn't respond. He just nodded, eyes distant, as if still watching Ava walk into the night. Martin returned home as the rain began to fall. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a steady curtain of water against the windows, soft and persistent, like the kind that stayed for hours. He closed the door behind him, locked it quietly, then walked to the dining table and laid out the folder Joshua had given him. The room was dim, lit only by a lamp in the corner. The air smelled of wet leaves and dust. He sat for a long while, staring at the pages. The resignation letter, the non-disclosure form, the hotel's internal memo marked confidential. Each one more damning than the last. But something still felt missing. Then he remembered the old laptop. It was tucked in a drawer in Ava's room, where she'd left it. Years ago, he'd replaced the battery, thinking maybe one day he'd find the courage to open it. That day had come. He powered it on. The screen flickered once, then steadied. Her desktop background was still there, a photograph of a lake at dusk, trees reflected in still water. On the desktop, there were only a few folders. One of them was titled Locked. He clicked it. A password prompt appeared. Martin sat back. He didn't know it. The next morning, he visited a local computer repair shop. A quiet young technician, no older than Ava had been, offered to help. We can bypass it, the boy said. Might take a few hours. Martin waited in silence, watching rain fall against the glass storefront. By mid-afternoon, the folder opened. Inside, there was only one file. A voice recording, dated 2 days before the wedding. He clicked play. Ava's voice filled the room. It was shaky, breathless, like she was speaking in secret. The kind of voice someone uses when the walls feel too thin. I don't know how long I'll have, she began. But if anything happens to me, I need someone to know. She spoke of Elliot Dane, how he'd cornered her after the reception walkthrough, how he whispered threats, smiled while saying them, how he promised to ruin Nicole's career, to make Ava look unstable if she ever told anyone. He knows people, she said. He controls everything. Her voice cracked. She paused, then continued. If something happens to me, look for him. Elliot Dane. He's the darkness behind the music and the laughter. He hides in plain sight, wrapped in applause. Martin felt the weight of her words settle into the room. The air seemed thinner. He reached to pause the recording, but couldn't. At the end, Ava's voice softened. I left the name. In my Bible. Page 346. Someone will find it. Someday. The audio ended. Martin leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands covering his face. He stayed like that, unmoving, as the rain tapped steadily against the roof. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was full of ghosts. The truth had been there all along. In her voice. In the Bible. In the words no one had wanted to hear. Elliot Dane wasn't just the last person to see Ava. He was the one who made sure no one else ever would. Martin sent everything, Joshua's folder, Ava's recording, the page from the Bible, to the Austin Police Department. He waited by the phone, checking his inbox every few hours, heart ticking like a clock wound too tight. The reply came 2 days later. The voice on the line was professional, polite, and cold. "We've reviewed the materials, Mr. Black. There's no concrete evidence to justify reopening the case. The witness is unverified. The recording lacks timestamping or corroboration. We can't proceed." Martin hung up without a word. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wood grain, listening to the refrigerator hum. It was the same hum that filled the house the night Ava didn't come home. He stood, walked to the study, and opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside were 2 neatly stacked copies of the documents, the internal hotel report, the resignation, the non-disclosure agreement. He pulled one out, slid it into a manila envelope, and began writing on the front. His hand trembled, but his script stayed legible. To Elliot Dane. Martin knew where he lived now. The man had retired to a private estate just outside Dallas, behind high hedges and guarded gates. He was rarely seen, never photographed, and kept a low profile, but not low enough. Martin dressed in his best slacks, white shirt, clean shave. He drove down to Dallas, parked 2 streets over, and walked the rest. At the front gate, he posed as a courier delivering legal paperwork. The guard didn't question it. Some names, after all, still held weight. Martin left the envelope at the front door and, before turning away, slid a note inside the flap. "I know what you did. This time, you won't bury it." That night, the phone rang. No name, no number. Just breathing. Slow, deliberate, and close to the microphone. Then footsteps. Wood floors, slow pacing. A low creak. Then the line went dead. 3 days later, Martin found his car windshield smashed. Deep scratches carved into the hood. The police came, took a quick look, and shrugged. "Probably local kids," they said. "It happens." But Martin knew better. He didn't panic. He didn't speak. He went inside, sat at his desk, and turned on Ava's recording again. He listened to her voice in the dark, each sentence now etched into his memory. He paused at one line, rewound, played it again. He started taking notes. Every pause, every inflection, every word she whispered, he wrote down. Later that week, he met with the family's old attorney. A man in his 60s now, grayer, softer spoken. Martin gave him the flash drive, along with Ava's Bible and a letter. "If anything happens to me," Martin said, "you release this. All of it. To the press. To the public. You don't wait." The attorney nodded. No questions. Just understanding. Martin drove home, heart steady. The rain came again that night, light and steady, tapping the windows. He didn't sleep. The next morning, he called Father Dawson, the old priest from Ava's church. The man remembered her vividly. "She always sang with her eyes closed," he said, like she was already somewhere else. Martin asked to use the chapel, just for an hour. That Sunday, under soft light and worn wooden beams, he stood before a row of empty pews. He laid out the evidence, one sheet at a time. The recording played through a speaker at the altar. Ava's voice echoed through the chapel, trembling but clear. "I don't know how long I'll have," she said again. "But if something happens to me, find him." Martin raised his eyes to the cross above the pulpit. He spoke, and for the first time in 25 years, someone listened. The church smelled of old pine and candle wax. Dust hung in the light, soft as breath. A few rows of pews were filled, neighbors, retired reporters, former choir members, a handful of curious strangers. Martin stood near the altar, a small table beside him. On it, Ava's Bible, a printed transcript, and a speaker no bigger than a shoebox. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he played the recording. Ava's voice filled the chapel. Even those who had heard it already sat still, as if afraid to breathe. The fear in her tone, the way she paused before saying his name, Elliot Dane, it silenced every whisper in the room. Then Martin laid out the documents. The incident report, Joshua Langford's resignation, the non-disclosure form. He held up a list of 3 names, staff members, who had worked under Elliot that night. 2 had moved states. 1 had stayed close. From the back row, a hand rose. A woman, small-framed, gray hair pinned neatly, stood with effort. She wore a nurse's cardigan, white shoes, hands trembling as they gripped her purse. Her voice was steady, though it cracked on the second sentence. "My name is Elizabeth Moore," she said. "I worked at Whisper Pines. Night shift. Linen service." Martin turned. The room went still again. "I saw Ava that night," Elizabeth said. "She was in the back storage room. She'd been hit. Her face was bleeding. She looked scared, like she wanted to speak but couldn't." She paused. Her fingers curled into the strap of her bag. "I started to go in to help, but Elliot was there, blocking the door. He told me to go home, that it wasn't my concern." She swallowed. "I went home." The room seemed to lean toward her. Martin met her eyes. "Why now?" he asked gently. "Because I've lived with it," she whispered. "Every year. Every Sunday when the choir sings. Every time I see a young woman walking alone." Her words shifted everything. The press took notes. Someone hit record on their phone. That same day, the local news picked up the story. By evening, the Austin Police Department released a statement. They would reopen the case. Within a week, investigators began reviewing archives. One file stood out, an unnamed female body, buried near the edge of Whisper Pines in 1996. The remains had been found during a property expansion, but never identified. No signs of violence. No obvious match in missing persons at the time. Case closed. Until now. They obtained DNA from Ava's childhood hairbrush, one her father had kept sealed in a plastic bag in a drawer for 25 years. The results came back in 48 hours. The body was not Ava's. She might still be alive. 2 days later, a storage room at the local parish was unlocked for the first time in years. Inside, among old tapes and choir recordings, someone found a labeled VHS box. Spring Choir 1996, Youth Evening. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. In the final 2 minutes, a figure appeared just behind the choir exit doors. Ava, her blue dress torn at the shoulder, a man at her side. They were heading toward the delivery bay. A deacon recognized the man. "That's not Elliot," he said. "That's his brother, Wade Dane, a former delivery contractor. History of assault. Left town in 1997. Never returned. His last known address was an abandoned property in West Texas. No forwarding contact. No employment since." The pieces were no longer scattered. Martin stood again in the chapel the next morning. The sun through the stained glass lit his daughter's Bible in amber and red. He didn't speak, just pressed his hand to the page where her handwriting remained. It was all real now. The truth hadn't just returned. It had been waiting. The investigation gained momentum quickly. After identifying Wade Dane in the grainy church footage, detectives traced a license plate number from the back of the old delivery truck. The vehicle had changed hands over the years, registered in different counties, sold for cash, reported stolen once, then resurfaced. Its final registration led them to a remote property on the edge of New Mexico, a broken-down ranch tucked behind rows of dry brush and forgotten fence posts. They moved in before dawn. The land was silent, the kind of silence that lives in places where no one has asked questions for years. Inside the main house, officers found signs of life. An old stove still warm, worn women's clothing folded in a basket, food tins dated from months ago. In the back, there was a locked room. The hinges were rusted, but the lock was new. When they pried it open, they found a single cot, a lantern, and a leather-bound journal left on a crate beside a cracked mirror. The last page was dated just 3 weeks earlier. The handwriting was unsteady, but still hers. Ava Black. I am alive. I am still waiting. 1 week later, in a care home just 30 miles away, a nurse entered the community dining room with a clipboard in hand. She paused. One of the women, thin, graying, head bowed, looked up. The nurse blinked twice before setting the clipboard down and walking straight to the director's office. By nightfall, the fingerprints had been matched. It was her. Ava. 49 years old. Hair streaked with white. Face gaunt. Shoulders sloped from years of survival, not surrender. For the first 10 years, she had been locked away, moved from place to place. After that, Wade Dane, using a false identity, let her live in isolation, always under threat, without documents, without contact. Every time she tried to ask for help, people turned away. They thought she was unstable. She started to believe it too. But one thing kept her grounded. The Bible. The one her father gave her. She remembered hiding the note, folding the page, writing JL. She remembered whispering the words into her recorder, over and over. One day, she told herself, he'll find it. He'll read it. And he did. With Ava's reappearance, the case turned. Police tracked Wade Dane to a trailer home near Santa Rosa. He resisted. They arrested him under a fake name, but the truth followed quickly. The evidence, the journal, the fingerprint match, and Ava's testimony were enough. They reopened the case against Elliot Dane. The past was no longer buried. Ava, though frail, chose to speak. In a public hearing aired across local stations, she stood at the podium, eyes calm, voice uneven but clear. Her father sat in the front row, clutching the edge of his seat, tears streaking down his cheeks. She opened with a single line from the Gospel of John. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The room fell into silence. She spoke of the night she disappeared, of Elliot's threats, of Wade's cruelty, of the fear that settled into her bones, and the silence that followed her through every locked door. She said the world had forgotten her, but her father hadn't. She didn't speak for pity. She spoke because silence was the only thing that had protected them, and it was silence that almost killed her. That night, Martin sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand gently between his palms. She looked at him, smiled faintly, and said, "I always knew you'd hear me." He whispered back, "I never stopped listening." The moment they saw each other, neither of them spoke. No dramatic gestures, no gasps, no rush of words. Just silence, thick and full. Ava stood by the doorway, thinner than he remembered, her shoulders drawn and like she hadn't quite learned how to be seen again. Martin stepped forward, slow and unsure, like a man walking through a dream he didn't trust. When their arms finally wrapped around each other, it wasn't tight. It was trembling. They held on as if trying to remember the shape of what they'd lost. The sobs didn't come right away. They came in waves, quiet at first, then deeper, until Ava's hand clutched the back of her father's jacket and Martin's chin dropped to her shoulder. She touched his face gently, fingers tracing the wrinkles that hadn't been there before. "I thought you forgot me," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, almost unfamiliar. He shook his head. "I never stopped looking." The nurses gave them space. The hallway lights dimmed. Somewhere down the corridor, a radio played an old hymn, faint and low. That night, Martin stayed beside her bed, just listening to her breathe. In the days that followed, word spread through the town. People who hadn't spoken her name in years walked through the doors of the care home, unsure what to say. They brought casseroles, flowers, a few childhood photos pulled from old albums. Some just came to sit, to look at her, to believe she was real. Many cried. A few apologized. Most just sat in silence. Ava took it all in quietly. She was slower now, cautious with smiles, gentle with her words. She spent long hours in the sunroom, a blanket around her shoulders, eyes lost in the light coming through the window. She asked to return home, not to the city, but to the little house on Cedar Lane. Her room was still there, mostly untouched. The same floral curtains, the same bookshelf. On her second night home, she opened the Bible. Her fingers brushed the folded page. The ink had faded, but it was still there. Jail, he saw, but he said nothing. She touched the edge of the paper and smiled faintly. It hadn't been a dream. She visited the church a few days later, walked past the pew where she used to sit. The wood was smoother now, worn from years of hands and knees. Some of her old choir friends were there. A few had grown gray. Others had married, had children. One or two looked away when she approached. Guilt does that. But Ava didn't flinch. She took a breath, stepped forward, and said, "We can't go back, but we can forgive." No one answered, but they didn't need to. That Sunday, the church hosted a small service. Not formal. No newspaper, no cameras. Just the people who remembered her voice. The pastor welcomed her back, then stepped aside. She stood near the front, the same spot she'd sung from as a girl. Her hands trembled slightly. Her breath caught. Then she sang. It was not strong. It was not perfect. But it carried. The notes wavered, then settled. Her voice, raspy but full of faith, filled the chapel and reached the rafters. Some closed their eyes. Some wept. Martin stood in the back, hands folded, watching. That day, it didn't matter what had been stolen. What mattered was that she had returned, and her voice had found its way home. 25 years. A quarter of a lifetime. Enough time for most people to stop hoping. But Martin never chose forgetting. In a quiet house on the corner of a street in Austin, he kept Ava's Bible on the table. Not to read, but to remember. To remember faith. To remember her voice rising through the chapel air. To remember the night he almost gave up, until a folded page brought it all back. Ava's story isn't just about survival. It is proof that truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds a way to speak. Sometimes through a single name, a glance, a voice you thought the world had silenced. She didn't return as the girl who left. The years had changed her. Her hair carried streaks of white. Her body bore scars. But the deeper marks were the ones no one could see. Still, she carried no bitterness. When someone asked how she survived, she didn't talk about anger or vengeance. She said quietly, "I'm here because my father never gave up." And sometimes, that's all it takes. Not a hero, not a miracle. Just someone who stays. Someone who keeps a room ready. Who keeps a Bible on the table. Who refuses to let memory be erased. At the closing service held in the church where she once sang, Ava stepped to the pulpit. Her hands trembled, but her voice reached every corner of the room. She read from Psalm 23 verse 4. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Her eyes glowed, not with youth, but with something stronger. Like each year that had been stolen was now returning, piece by piece, through every tearful embrace, every whisper of your home. This story isn't just about a missing girl. It's about memory, about what we choose to keep alive. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest things, a folded page in a forgotten Bible, carry the most powerful voices. They wait until someone listens. If you've ever lost faith, ever wondered if light can reach through years of darkness, remember, truth can be hidden, but never erased. What did Ava's journey stir in you? If her story made you pause, reflect, or remember someone lost, share your thoughts below. We read every word, and if it touched something quiet in your heart, we hope you'll like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Stories, where we honor the voices that nearly disappeared and help bring forgotten pieces back into the light. Thank you for listening.